They were not orphans. Most of them had mothers, fathers, siblings, families who were poor, or unmarried, or indigenous, or simply unable to navigate a system that had decided, before they even walked through the door, that their children did not belong to them. The Quebec government took those children. The Catholic Church received them. And then, in a decision so cynical, so calculated, and so devastating in its consequences that it took decades for the full truth to emerge, someone realized that a child classified as mentally ill was worth more money than a child classified as an orphan. So they reclassified them. Thousands of children, healthy children, children whose only crime was being born to the wrong family in the wrong province at the wrong time, were certified as mentally deficient by doctors who had not examined them, transferred from orphanages to psychiatric institutions, and subjected to what happened in those institutions for years. The man whose government oversaw this was Maurice Duplessis, Premier of Quebec. His name is on hospitals, on streets, on public buildings across the province. The children his system destroyed have no monuments. Most of them have no records. Some of them have no graves that anyone has been able to find. This is the story of the Duplessis Orphans. To understand what happened to the Duplessis Orphans, you have to understand Quebec in the 1940s and 1950s. Quebec under Maurice Duplessis, who served as premier from 1936 to 1939 and again from 1944 until his death in 1959, was one of the most politically controlled societies in mid-20th century North America. The Catholic Church was not simply a religious institution in Quebec. It was the administrative backbone of the province's social services. The church ran the hospitals, the schools, the orphanages, the asylums. It educated the children, cared for the sick, housed the poor, and buried the dead. And it did all of this in a relationship with the Duplessis government that was less a separation of church and state than a merger of two mutually beneficial power structures. Duplessis needed the Church's institutional infrastructure and its moral authority over Quebec's Catholic population. The Church needed Duplessis' government funding and political protection. Each gave the other what it needed, and the people at the bottom of that arrangement, the poor, the unmarried mothers, the children, had no voice in any of it. In post-war Quebec, the provincial government funded orphanages at a rate of approximately 1.25 per child per day. It funded psychiatric institutions at a rate of approximately 2.75 per child per day. The difference was 1.50 cents per child per day. Across thousands of children, across years, the financial incentive to reclassify children from orphan to psychiatric patient was not subtle. It was built into the funding structure of the provincial government. And the people administering that structure, the religious orders running the institutions, the doctors providing the certifications, the government officials approving the transfers, understood the arithmetic perfectly. Beginning in the late 1940s, children in Quebec orphanages began to be transferred to psychiatric institutions in significant numbers. The transfers required medical certification. A doctor had to sign a document stating that the child was mentally deficient and required psychiatric care. The certifications were signed, sometimes after cursory examination, sometimes after no examination at all, sometimes by doctors who later admitted they had certified children as mentally ill without ever meeting them. The children were transferred, the funding rate changed, the money flowed, and the children entered a world that was not designed for children. The psychiatric institutions that received the reclassified children were not schools. They were not treatment facilities in any meaningful clinical sense. They were custodial institutions, places designed to contain and manage adult psychiatric patients. The children placed in them were housed with adults, including adults with severe psychiatric conditions, including adults who were violent. The institutional environment, the locked wards, the restraints, the medication used for behavioral management, the complete absence of education or normal childhood development, was designed for a population that the children placed there were not part of. Education essentially ceased for children transferred to psychiatric institutions. Quebec law required that children receive schooling. The psychiatric institutions were exempt from this requirement because their residents were classified as mentally deficient and therefore, by the institutional logic of the time, uneducable. Children who had been attending school in the orphanages, children who were learning to read, to write, to do arithmetic, were transferred to institutions where no one taught them anything, where the days were structured around the management of behavior, not the development of minds. Some children spent years in these institutions. Some spent decades. They arrived as children and emerged, if they emerged, as adults who had received no education, no preparation for independent life, and no acknowledgement from any official source that what had been done to them was wrong. The reclassification and transfer were, in themselves, a profound injustice. But inside the institutions, something else was happening that took even longer to come to light. Some of the children in Quebec's psychiatric institutions were used as subjects in medical experiments. The experiments documented in survivor testimony and in the limited records that have been made available include drug trials, pharmaceutical companies testing new medications on institutionalized children who could not consent and whose guardians, the religious orders running the institutions, provided consent on their behalf. Electroconvulsive therapy administered to children without clinical justification. Surgical procedures performed experimentally. The full scope of the experimentation has never been established. The records are incomplete. Some were destroyed. Some remain sealed behind privacy legislation that was not designed with the interests of survivors in mind. What is documented in survivor testimony, in the accounts of former staff, in the fragments of institutional records that have been made public, is enough to establish that children in these institutions were treated not as patients requiring care, but as a population available for use. Available because they were classified as mentally deficient. Available because they had no legal advocates. Available because the institutions that held them were accountable to no one who had their interests at heart. The religious orders that administered Quebec's psychiatric institutions in the Duplessis era have never fully accounted for their role in what happened. The orders received the children. They signed the intake documents. They administered the institutions where the abuse occurred. They provided the consent that allowed medical experimentation to proceed. And when survivors began to speak publicly in the 1990s, the initial response from the church was denial, followed eventually by a carefully worded acknowledgement that stopped well short of full accountability. In 1999, the Quebec government offered a settlement to Duplessis orphan survivors of approximately $25 million, to be distributed among an estimated 3,000 survivors. The amount worked out to roughly $8,000 per person. The survivors rejected the settlement as inadequate. They continued to push for a fuller acknowledgement, for access to their records, for the exhumation and identification of children buried in unmarked graves on institutional grounds. The church contributed $3 million to the settlement fund. It did not open its archives. It did not conduct an independent inquiry. It did not name the specific institutions, the specific religious orders, the specific individuals responsible for specific acts. It offered money, it withheld truth, and it called that reconciliation. Children who died in Quebec's psychiatric institutions during the Duplessis era were not always returned to their families. In many cases, particularly for children who had been in institutional care for years, whose family connections had attenuated or been severed entirely, the bodies were buried on institutional grounds, in cemeteries that were not always properly marked, in graves that did not always carry the names of the people buried in them. Survivor groups have spent decades attempting to locate and identify these graves. The work is ongoing. Some sites have been identified, some remains have been found. The full accounting, how many children are buried, where, under what names, or under no names at all, has not been completed. In 2004, excavations at the site of the former Mont Providence Institution in Montreal uncovered the remains of children in conditions that suggested the burials had not been conducted with the care that the church's public image would have implied. The institutional records that would allow the graves to be matched to names, that would allow families to know where their children or grandchildren or siblings are buried, are held by the church. Access has been partial, inconsistent, and conditional in ways that serve the institution's interests rather than the survivors. The children are in the ground. Their names are in the files, and the files remain closed. Maurice Duplessis died in 1959 at the height of his power. He did not live to see the full consequences of what his government had built. He did not face any legal accountability for the reclassification scheme. He died as he had lived, as the most powerful political figure in Quebec, celebrated by his supporters, feared by his opponents, and entirely unchallenged by the institutional structures that might have held him to account. His name was given to roads, to public buildings, to the Maurice Duplessis Regional County Municipality in Quebec. He remains a genuinely controversial historical figure in the province, condemned by some, defended by others, the subject of ongoing historical debate about the balance of his legacy. The Duplessis Orphans do not appear prominently in that debate. They are a footnote in most accounts of his premiership, a dark detail, acknowledged briefly, then moved past in favor of his political achievements and his conflicts with the federal government. The children who were classified as mentally deficient so that the institutions holding them could bill the government at a higher rate, they did not get a regional county municipality named after them. They got $8,000 each, if they were still alive to collect it, if they could prove they qualified, if they had the documentation to support their claim, documentation that was held by the institutions that had harmed them in archives that those institutions controlled. In the early 1990s, a group of Duplessis orphan survivors began to organize. They called themselves the Duplessis Orphans Committee. They gathered testimony, they documented experiences, they went public with accounts that Quebec's institutions, the government, the church, the medical establishment, had spent decades hoping would remain private. The accounts were specific. They were consistent across survivors who had not known each other and had no opportunity to coordinate their stories. They described the same institutions, the same practices, the same culture of impunity, the same experience of being children in a system that had decided they were not fully human. Some survivors described being told explicitly by staff in the institutions that they were worthless, that they would never leave, that no one was looking for them and no one would come. Some had been told their parents were dead. Their parents were not dead. They were simply poor, or unmarried, or indigenous, or otherwise defined by the Quebec of the 1940s and 1950s as unfit to raise a child, a definition that had less to do with their actual fitness as parents than with their position in a social hierarchy that the church and the Duplessis government jointly maintained. The survivors who came forward in the 1990s were not young. They were middle-aged adults carrying decades of damage from institutions that had taken their childhoods, their education, their family connections, and their identities. And they were asking for the first time for someone official to say, yes, this happened, it was wrong, and you deserved better. The Quebec government's response to the survivors' demands evolved slowly and inadequately over the course of the 1990s and 2000s. A 1997 government report acknowledged that the reclassification had occurred, that children had been transferred from orphanages to psychiatric institutions for financial reasons, not clinical ones. This was at least an official acknowledgement that the thing survivors had been saying for years had in fact happened. The $25 million settlement offer in 1999 was rejected by survivor groups as insufficient. They had asked for $75,000 per survivor, an amount that still fell short of what genuine restitution for a stolen childhood might look like, but which at least acknowledged the scale of the harm. The government offered $8,000. The church contributed an additional $1,000 per person, eventually raised to slightly more. The total remained a fraction of what survivors had requested. Beyond the financial inadequacy, survivors demanded access to their records, their original birth records, their institutional files, the documentation of what had been done to them. Full access was never provided. What was provided was partial, inconsistent, and often arrived too late. Survivors who had spent decades searching for their birth families, for their own names, for any documentary evidence of who they had been before the institutions took them, received fragments rather than answers. Some survivors died before the settlement process concluded. Some died without ever finding the information they had spent their lives searching for. The records of the Duplessis-era institutions, the files that document which children were transferred, on what basis, by which doctors, to which institutions, are among the most contested documents in Quebec's recent history. Some are held by the provincial government, some are held by the Catholic Church, some were transferred between institutions and became lost in the process. Some were deliberately destroyed. The evidence for deliberate destruction is not conclusive, but the pattern of missing records in precisely the areas where accountability would be most damaging is difficult to explain as ordinary archival attrition. Survivors and their advocates have argued for years that the records should be centralized, fully disclosed, and made accessible to people whose lives they document. The argument is straightforward. These are records about specific people, created during a period when those people had no legal standing to control what was recorded about them or to access it afterward. The people the records concern have a fundamental interest in seeing them. The counter-arguments, privacy concerns, institutional confidentiality, the administrative complexity of processing requests, are the same arguments that institutions use when the information they hold is damaging to themselves. The files remain partially closed. The survivors who are still alive are elderly. Time is working in the institution's favor, as it always has. Quebec today is a different province from the Quebec of Maurice Duplessis. The quiet revolution of the 1960s, the period of rapid secularization and modernization that followed Duplessis' death, transformed Quebec's social institutions. The church lost its administrative role in healthcare, education, and social services. The province built a modern secular welfare state. The relationship between church and state was, in the space of roughly a decade, fundamentally restructured. The Duplessis Orphans are a product of the old Quebec, the Quebec before the Quiet Revolution, before secularization, before the dismantling of the church's institutional power. But the survivors of that Quebec are still here. The oldest are in their 80s. The youngest, children who were reclassified in the late 1950s, just before Duplessis' death, are in their late 60s and 70s. They are alive. They are still asking for full access to their records. They are still asking for an accounting of what happened in the institutional graveyards. The province has moved on. The survivors have not been given the information that would allow them to. The Duplessis Orphans are not an isolated anomaly in Canadian history. They are part of a pattern, a consistent pattern across regions, across decades, across different institutional and governmental contexts, in which children from marginalized communities were removed from their families, placed in institutional settings, subjected to conditions and treatments that caused serious harm, and then denied full accountability when the harm came to light. The residential schools, the 60s Scoop, the Millennium Scoop, the Duplessis Orphans, the Kenora Catholic Children's Aid Society, the Huronia Regional Centre in Ontario, where people with developmental disabilities were subjected to abuse over decades and received a settlement in 2013. The specific contexts differ, the populations differ, the administering institutions differ, but the structure is consistent. A state or church institution with power over a vulnerable population, accountability mechanisms that serve the institution rather than the population, and a period of decades between the harm and the acknowledgement. Canada is not unique in this pattern. But Canada has been unusually practiced at maintaining a public image of decency and progress while the pattern continues underneath. The Duplessis Orphans are one of the places where the image fails most completely, where the gap between what Canada says it is and what it has actually done is widest and most difficult to bridge. Somewhere in Quebec there are children buried in ground that no one is tending. They have numbers instead of names, or names that were given to them by institutions rather than by their mothers, or names that were recorded incorrectly in files that are now held behind closed archives. They died in institutions that received them as patients and held them as inventory. They were buried quickly, without ceremony, without their families present, because their families did not know they were dead, or did not know where they were, or had been told years earlier that they were gone and had stopped asking. This happened in Canada, in living memory, in a province that is part of a country that describes itself as one of the most humane and progressive societies on earth. The children in the ground are not a metaphor. They are not a symbol of something. They are specific children, with names, with families who lost them, with lives that were interrupted before they had fully begun, buried in unmarked or poorly marked graves on the grounds of institutions that are no longer operating, in a province that has never conducted the full accounting that would allow them to be found and returned to the families that were never given the chance to bury them properly. The Quiet Revolution changed Quebec. The survivors of the Duplessis era are still waiting for it to reach them. This is dark Canada, where the children who were buried without names wait to be given them back. Subscribe, because the children in the unmarked graves deserve to be named. And we are not done looking.